A bunch of cameras are set up in the different rooms of a house. It's almost 1 a.m., and a door creaks open in one of the bedrooms by itself. The men who have set up these cameras begin to narrate their reasoning behind this action. One of them feels like this house has an entity that makes others aware of its presence, whereas the other can't help but deny the grip this house holds on him. They both agree that a lot of inexplicable things happen in this house. Another man mentions the mysterious aura that this house holds. All these claims seem true as well, because the house does have a lot of creepy stuff, like old photographs of forgotten or deceased people, antique cross figurines, and possessions of the past. Alice recalls that she wanted a simple, A-frame house. Probably a loft upstairs with a balcony would have done the trick. She is the homeowner and was first drawn to this property by a beautiful and breathtaking meadow of wildflowers. That's when she decided to subcontract this house and get it built like how she wanted it. However, strange incidents started happening once the building started. The doors would slam and the doorbell would ring out of nowhere. One day, Alice bolted the door and heard a loud bang as soon as she went upstairs. When she looked, the door was wide open with the bolt still on. She made peace with the unusual activity and continued to live there until 2011. It was almost midnight and the house was dark. Alice was awakened by a total patch of broad daylight from the ceiling to the floor. After 10 seconds, it went out with a blink by itself. Alice hid under the covers but saw little red buttons of light in the pitch black of her room. She had a flashlight lying around nearby that she used to look around the room. Strangely, she found nothing, but she felt a presence watching her, observing her every move. She didn't understand what happened that night, but it terrified her to such an extent that she decided to no longer stay in the house by herself. She didn't mention any of this to the people in her town because she wasn't sure how they'd react. Her town, Florence, has residents who are good neighbors. They mostly keep to themselves but help each other out in times of distress or personal tragedies like the passing of a loved one. This southern town fosters a very country Bible Belt lifestyle, where some people are close-minded and some are open-minded. They're susceptible to not believing in ghosts, which is why Alice felt embarrassed. Therefore, she kept her paranormal experience to herself until it was decided to do a news program on her house. Alice narrated on the news how she once saw a candle levitate from one place to another once. The news program gave Alice the validation to share her story with others. This was a big moment for her as it opened her eyes to how real all this was. It was at this point that Alice began her search to look for someone who could come up with an explanation for her situation. A colleague recommended a young investigator named John Bullard to Alice. John works as a marketing director for 40 different restaurants. As a child, he'd often see shadow figures and hear voices which landed him in the paranormal world. He sought validation of what he was going through, so he did some research about the supernatural and the paranormal. Then, he started going to haunted places to test the waters and see if he'd be able to actually capture, feel, or sense something. He once caught a spirit voice on his equipment which changed him completely. His biggest goal on his journey was to document evidence that was clean, clear, and easy to view. Now he has ended up at Alice's ominous house in Florence, Mississippi, and is a bit skeptical about this case. Nonetheless, he wants to hear what Alice has to say first. John's intrigue builds up in the pre-investigation as his cameras capture things moving and lights going off. Of his 9 years of work, this is the longest he's worked on a single location. He films the house 24/7 on his DVR cameras in hopes of capturing the otherworldly presence in this house. Alice's house is now known to be haunted in her town. Another paranormal investigator, Brad Cooney, also verifies the well-documented evidence proving that the house is home to possibly some spirits as well. After having a career in boxing journalism, Brad has moved on to podcasts as he doesn't go to the fights anymore. A news segment on Alice's house caught his attention one day, so he contacted Alice and her friend because he lived close to the house. That was the beginning of his fascination with the paranormal. Brad instantly believed Alice's story when he first met her. His interest was even more heightened when he witnessed activity on the very first day of his visit to the house. He returned the next week and captured more inexplicable and unbelievable evidence. He had major technical failures because of the excessive spirit activity in the house, but his REM pod beeping aggressively was proof enough for him. His knowledge comes from research and hands-on experience, which is why he bought equipment to conduct proper investigations. He joined forces with John to investigate the house together. Since they didn't know each other before, it gave them a chance to be impartial and unbiased. It's been almost 3 years since Brad has been working the house and still gets surprised from time to time. He has managed to find the reality between some events, but they still remain to be debunked, which is why he keeps going. Brad investigates the house with his friend, Don, who's also a police officer. They call out to seek answers if there is anything or anyone else in the house besides them. Don and Brad are checking individual rooms of the house one at a time. This is when they hear one of the most profound noises they have ever heard throughout their investigation of the house. They progress from just observing the activity to actually initiating. They plan to do this by establishing contact with whatever or whoever is behind all this. When a door opens in front of them and a light turns on by itself, Brad puts a request out into the air. He encourages whatever unseen force is behind all this to shut the light again, and it happens. These direct responses can count as proof that spirits can hear them and are communicating with them. They are trying to gather as much of this information as possible in order to get a breakthrough. On the other hand, John believes that they are teaching the spirits how to communicate with humans. John does similar practices as well. When he senses a static charged energy, he loudly conveys the command for it to be turned up. This is also accompanied by the use of a lot of trigger objects in the house. For instance, they put up baseballs on the staircase, expecting the spirits to roll it down the stairs. They wait for days for the baseball to roll down and hit the floor, but nothing happens. But then one day, it just happened by itself when no one was in the house, and it was captured on the footage. It's happened several times since then, and they want more answers as to why these physics-defying instances occur. This has not only intrigued them but also made them question what happens in the afterlife. So, they bring in another person to this venture to get the answers they are looking for. Scott Thomas is a contractor who is brought in to test the foundation level of the home. He sets up his equipment and surveys the house under Alice's supervision. The house is completely level from side to side. However, there might be somewhat of a slope vertically, but it's not enough for the ball to roll down. Alice is relieved to hear this, because now she has a reason for the doors and windows opening and closing on their own. Alice is hopeful that bringing in experts will give them more clarity about why objects with no apparent energy source moved into this house. According to her, there is some sort of convergence of energy here that can't be explained. Next, an electrician named Wes Neely is called in to inspect the chandelier, which switched off in a direct response, and the overall wiring of the house. He verifies that the chandelier and its lights are working fine. He even checks the breaker and reports that the voltage levels are okay as well. He also confirms Alice's doubts that what they are studying here might not be due to technical difficulty. John questions Alice whether she pondered over what she had encountered the first few nights she didn't stay in the house. She responds that she was so sure that nobody would help her out, so she had made up her mind not to move back in here again. However, Brad and John are glad she reached out to them because there was a lot to uncover. But even then, they have to back away from the house at times because of how intense it gets. John is passionate about his field and its documentation, but this house pushes him to a whole other limit. Steve Gonsalves is another man invited by Alice to look into her house. At first, he was a bit hesitant but was convinced when he talked to her on the phone. It has been 10 years and Alice still hasn't slept in the house. All the things John and Brad showed him brought him here. He meets up with Alice at the house and enters ahead of his filming crew. He is going to turn all this up a notch. The theories in the paranormal world state that limestone, underground water, and other minerals can act as a conduit for paranormal activity. Interestingly, there are large limestone deposits under Florence, so Steve decides to explore this possibility in depth. John is also more inclined toward the idea that the spirits are associated with the land, not the house. This is further supported by the detail that disturbances occurred during the construction of the house too. Steve is dabbling with the theory that limestone possesses the ability to retain and release energy. A scientific mineral expert verifies this assumption with logic. Steve then questions whether underground water or moving water can create a static charge. The expert corrects him by explaining that items or mediums can be charged naturally, but new charges can't be formed on their own. Steve shows him the video of the baseball rolling down, which surprises him because he thought that happened due to an earthquake. The footage of the ball moving is shown to many knowledgeable people who hold expertise in different areas of science and physics, but all they can do is speculate instead of offering a concrete explanation. Steve tests the stairs with a magnet and compressed air to detect any foul play or trickery. He even goes under the stairs and applies force from there to see if the ball moves or not. All in all, he decides to rule out these physics-related hypotheses. Brad talks to Alice and John about how he has always wanted to see the lights that drive Alice out of her house. Out of all the time he has been in this house, he has never had an experience that extreme. As far as John is concerned, he was once in the upstairs bedroom. He was doing an EVP session there with the door closed in the company of another investigator. He could not believe his eyes when the bottom frame of the door turned bright white. He resembles it to a camera shutter comprising 2 to 3 flashes of light. He sat there in awe for a few minutes because it wasn't raining that night. There was no thunder and it never happened after that night. Brad considers this to be due to a factor other than a spirit or a ghost. His doubt goes toward the extraterrestrial creatures, as these lights could have come from a UFO. An elderly woman lives 7 miles away from Alice. When she was just a child, she remembers her house getting lit up in a globe. The light was brighter than the sun, according to her. This story is of the Harper's residents in the same town of Florence. The woman, Jeanette Harper, has a firm belief that there is too much space in this universe for Earthlings to be its only inhabitant. Steve moves on to questions about this light from his science experts. They make it known to him that light can't happen spontaneously. Instead, it must have an origin, which could be a reflection or other forms of energy transferring to become light. Walt Grayson is a weather forecaster who connects all this to a natural phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire. It involves a static energy discharge which causes a glow if built up for a long enough time. This is even more likely to happen if there's a medium present. Many physicists struggle with comprehending light's behavior, which is very flexible but also unpredictable at the same time. Alice still doesn't feel comfortable, because none of these researchers and scientists have given her definitive reassurance that those lights were caused by a force of nature. So as long as there's even a shred of doubt remaining in her mind, her fear won't subside. The idea of UFOs crossed her mind when she first encountered the lights. However, she has never seen anything that can reconcile this within her history. More things unravel as a very famous alien abduction case was recorded 3 hours south of Alice's house. What's fascinating is that the abductee claimed to see the same lights as Alice. His name is Calvin Parker, and he was abducted in 1973. He claims to have seen a UFO settle over a space in the river and blue light shone over his shoulders. A bright white light came out of the UFO when it opened. 3 robot-looking creatures came out of the UFO and 2 of them got a hold of Calvin's sail. He was taken on board and examined. He didn't know about UFOs or aliens until this happened to him. In addition to this, there are fringe theories that suggest that paranormal and alien-related phenomena are actually interdimensional. Modern physics also agrees with this under the statement that the world is multidimensional. However, humans have not even come close to discovering these extra dimensions or even making any real or measurable progress in this regard. Steve sees the potential of extraterrestrial life in this case, but hardly thinks that it is in Alice's bedroom. It can also be something ghostly or out of this world. Steve, John, Brad, and Alice all team up one night to do a thorough inquiry of what really scared Alice. John calls out to all and any spirits present within the house and urges them to communicate with him. He wants them to come downstairs, give him signs of their existence, and show themselves. The REM pod starts going off and Brad wants to look for a pattern. Seeing the light and the REM pod go off at the same time will be the most convincing for him. Brad gets what he asked for soon after, as all 3 REM pods go off together, but he still isn't 100% sold. Their devices that are supposed to measure energy were spread out all across the house. All of them going off at once is an indication that they were indeed surrounded by a presence. Alice begins to pray as others continue to work. One of the disturbances is in the back room, which makes John feel uneasy as soon as he gets in. 2 different mediums have hinted at a figure being near a chair in that room on different occasions. The presence comes across as stern, guarded, and protective towards the room, according to the mediums. Alice adds a psychic to the mix even though Steve doesn't agree with their method. They source out a psychic from California who has no context or preface about this case to add credibility to her final judgment. The psychic goes by the name of Jill Morris and is welcomed by Alice at the doorstep. Alice lets Jill inside and allows her the liberty to move as she pleases around the house. Jill starts with the lower level of the house and walks out the back door into the yard. Then, she comes back in and asks Alice if there was a house by this property that was torn off. Alice gives an affirmative reply, which is helpful for Jill. She continues to work her magic around the house and goes through the first floor too. Finally, she sits down with Alice and recalls the unusual dreams she had about a week ago. She documents these dreams into a dream diary and even sketches some of the visuals too. She shows Alice a sketch of the back door she saw in her dream way before visiting the house. The sketch has a walking stick leaning on the door and Alice collects walking sticks like that. Jill gives Alice some fair warning before explicitly informing her that she got a very sad imprint from this house. Jill insinuates that there was somebody murdered in Alice's backyard. She has a feeling that the original landowners of this house didn't treat people very nicely. She can feel the male in this house who used to be a really evil person, which is a claim Jill seldom makes about someone. He had some part in the murder of the man out in the backyard. The male entity is going to do everything in its power to get Alice to give up the house. Jill even goes as far as saying that if he could burn this house, he would. Jill was able to see things constantly on fire, and Alice knows she's telling the truth because others have made similar claims. Alice is trying to process all this horrifying information about this cursed house when the REM pod goes off again. Alice continues conversing with Jill about how she has heard of the history of fires in this town. Florence has burned several times. The first fire was towards the west and the town was rebuilt facing the north afterward. Jill and Alice are discussing how, or why, the first fire in Florence happened when the fire alarm in the house acts up. It is spooky that throughout the filming of the whole documentary, the only time that the smoke detector beeped was during talk of the town fire and potential arson. Alice tells Jill about her neighbor Erin, who moved in next door when she was just 5 years old. She had a very significant part in this house, but what's relevant is that as a kid, she used to inform Alice that there was something buried in her backyard. This would confuse Alice, but little Erin got very negative vibes from a specific spot in her backyard. One time she got so determined to prove her point to Alice and her parents that she decided to dig it up. There is a property line of tall oak trees between Erin and Alice's house. Erin's family members got a similar eerie feeling once they crossed the oak trees, as if they have entered another dimension. Erin was visiting Alice once and they were sitting in the dining room under the chandelier. Suddenly, Alice pointed Erin's attention toward the chandelier, which had tilted to the side with no tension in its chain. They both screamed in terror and ran for the front door. This is when the chandelier let go and was swinging so hard and far like a scary pendulum. That night, Erin leads Alice and the others to the spots where she gets the feelings from. As the group stands over it, Erin explains how this particular piece of land always made her uncomfortable even as a child. To add fuel to the fire, Alice adds that Erin discovered 4 bodies near the Pearl River, so she's an authentic source in such matters. Erin gets nervous when John decides to have an EVP session. He promises to support her throughout the process and calls out to the spirits. When he demands a sign from the spirits if he knows Erin, they all hear some rustling in the bushes. A loud thump is audible when he questions if there is something buried in the yard. Erin feels really sick and nauseous by now and needs to take a breather. She throws up soon after. Later on, a cadaver dog search team comes to the house to cater to the claims of a body buried in the yard. The dog keeps circling around a clump of trees and looking up at them, out of all the other trees on the property. The dog's owner suspects that these trees grew out of those deceased bodies, using them as nourishment. She gives the verdict that a cemetery could have existed here. Jeanette shows Steve the original part of Florence's cemetery on a map, but all of its records were burned in the fire, so that part remains unaccounted for. Alice's house lies somewhere around or on top of this unmarked section of the town's cemetery. Any burial that might have taken place there must have happened before the fire, which explains the absence of records for it. Steve asks Alice what it would take for her to move back into this house. Alice thinks she could do it if she had someone living with her. Steve hopes and prays that this whole process is helpful for Alice and allows her to heal and recover. He wishes for her to be at peace in this house because her dream home was taken away from her. Alice still hasn't sold the house because she believes it has a purpose. She connected with a lot of wonderful, genuine people in her journey to open up this house. Brad thinks very fondly of Alice and is sure that they will remain pals even in their afterlife. This whole experience has been very beneficial and fulfilling for Brad. John wishes to see Alice in a happy place where she's satisfied with the work they've done so far. After the documentary is wrapped and the crew gets ready to leave, something strange happens. The house isn't ready to let them go just yet. They have removed almost all the cameras when the ball moves one last time. They all scour through the footage to get one last bit of satisfaction out of all this. This is elevated by the sound of a door shutting by itself. 1 week later, Brad keeps digging into this and makes a breakthrough. He has found a movement in the reflection of the chandelier. The reflection shows the door opening and closing as if someone passed through it, which is undeniably chilling. There is no end to this madness after all. This house will continue to draw in curious minds and show them some of its marvels from time to time. However, one interprets its oddity as a reflection of one's belief and faith.